morning we are going to continue through the book of Genesis by looking at Genesis 32. So if you have your Bible, please turn to Genesis 32. And while you're doing that, I wanted to give the sad news for some of you, for some it won't matter at all, that tomorrow March Madness will officially be over. Tomorrow, North Carolina and Kansas University are going to play for the championship. And did anyone here, I don't know how many basketball fans we have, but did anyone here catch the North Carolina Duke game yesterday? Yes, it was such a good game. For those of you who know nothing about college sports, Duke and North Carolina are like the Hatfields and the McCoys. They're the biggest rivalry maybe in all of sports, and they were coming up against each other in the Final Four. Whoever wins gets to go to the championship, and it was down to the last second. North Carolina beat them in the last second and will go on and play for the championship tomorrow. And the interesting thing about March Madness is I was trying really hard, because I was like, I don't want to exaggerate if I say this. I was trying really hard to think, if I have ever watched a college basketball game outside of March, and I couldn't think of one time I've ever watched a college basketball game in its fullness outside of the month of March. But when the month of March comes, I'm all in. I don't have a school I follow. I've filled out brackets a couple of times and want whoever I pick to win, but I don't really care at all until you get to March. And the reason that it's so good is it really in March doesn't really become much about basketball anymore, because you could have a really great team upset by a team that wasn't that good, and it really just doesn't, it's not the technicals of basketball, it's these storylines that develop from throwing together 64 of the best teams and just saying, all right, let's see what happens if we just play a crazy amount of basketball in a month. And so you have these great storylines. You have, your number one teams that are the dominant teams everybody's scared of. We all make the mistake of putting them way too far into the tournament on our brackets. And you have these, teams that everybody expects to win. And then you have teams like North Carolina this year that historically they're good, and they've had success in the tournament, but they weren't really that great that year. And so they're they may do good, they may not, we don't really know. And then you have your teams that are kind of the underdogs, that, they got into the tournament, but no one really expects them to do great. And then you have the underdogs you've never even heard of. That's like a satellite school for the University of Alaska. And you're going, who in the world are they? I saw something and they're one of the better teams, but if you follow it all, there's Gonzaga University, and I saw somebody say that the Google searches for Gonzaga University in March go to an all-time high. They said it's similar to the numbers of people who search Santa Claus in December, everybody's going, is this a real school? Why do I keep hearing about them only in March? And so you have all of these different factors and all of these storylines, and it always just ends up being intriguing. You'll see these upsets, and you'll see these, great things happen. And one of the really interesting things within the college basketball tournament historically was there was a long-lasting record that a number 16 team, so they have 4 divisions, they rank them from 1 to 16, and then the top team plays bottom team. And so you have number 16 teams would be the last place playing number 1 teams in the first round. And in all of the years of the tournament, there had never been a number 16 team who had beat a number 1 team. And so every year you go, okay, I'm going to have to watch this game. I know it's going to happen because it's never been done. Number 16 team has never beat a number 1 team until 2018, when the prestigious school we all know and love, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, somehow snuck their way into the March Madness tournament and beat the team who was everybody expected to win the championship that year, the University of Virginia. They came in and they beat them, and they beat them well. and were able to be the first 16 seed, the first last place seed to beat the number 1 seed. And this was just shocking, it was shocking for them to be able to do this, because before this, the record was 0-142 for 16 seeds against number 1 seeds. Now it's 1-143, but it's only been done once. And that tells you that this was kind of the most humbling moment that ever took place in college basketball. Of every 16 seed that's played every number 1 seed, none of them have lost until the University of Virginia did in 2018. And so it goes without saying, they were embarrassed. They were just ashamed. We were supposed to be the number 1 team, and now we lost to a team nobody's ever heard of. But the interesting thing, and what kind of adds into the intriguing storylines of March Madness, is that there's always next year. And this team who had been humbled and embarrassed in front of the whole world, the next year went on to fly through the tournament and to win the championship in 2019. And you just look at this and you think of this idea of being humbled and how we experience these humbling moments in our life. And, with thinking of that, I go, that's one of the things, especially if you played sports before, you go, that's something that will haunt me the rest of my life. But then you see them come up from that, and after kind of coming to an end of themselves as a team, they get stronger and are able to go on and win the championship the following year. And this really reminds me, as we've been talking about the life of Jacob, of how this figure, Jacob, who had been through all these ups and downs in life, he, as we saw last week, had come out of being basically enslaved by Laban and mistreated, and he had gotten out of that. He was victorious. He was his own independent man with his independent wealth and his large family, and he had come out of that situation victorious and encouraged. But then he found himself immediately humbled by the fear of what lied ahead, and by God himself, as we'll see how God humbles him in this moment. And so we see he was coming off this high, everything was going good, and then he's humbled by the reality that as he enters back into the land of Canaan, as Jennifer said a moment ago, his brother, who had wanted to kill him for what he had done, was waiting for him, and he knew he would finally have to come face to face with him. And so for years, Jacob had been able to put his differences with his brother aside. He's in a different country, he doesn't have to really worry about his brother present, but now he would have to face him as he heads back into his homeland. And as he continued his journey, we see that he kind of headed toward Esau like a lamb going to the slaughter. He just was very afraid and saying, there's not really a way out of this, and, my brother's a mighty warrior, and he's going to be able to defeat me. And so he kind of looks like a lamb going to the slaughter. But what we see within that is that in this terrified state is where God shows up for Jacob and prepares him to be able to handle this situation and handle situations that would come in the future. And so here we see a Jacob who had been growing spiritually. He had began to trust more in the promises of God, but there was still work to be done, and we see that God does that work in him and prepares him to be able to be faithful in future situations. And so in chapter 32, we see Jacob really coming to the end of himself. But within that unraveling of himself, we also see how God makes himself strong in Jacob's weakness and how he continues to do the same for us today. And so we want us to look at this chapter today and see how we are often humbled by God, but in that humbling, we are able to be strong in God. So as we look into that, let's go ahead and say a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into verse 1 of chapter 32. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you just for your blessing and your constant examples of faithfulness to your people, Lord. And we thank you that as we look at the grace you extended to Jacob, Lord, that we can see a similar grace that you extend to us, so we can have hope and be encouraged in you, Lord. So I just pray you use this time to glorify you and to bless us and to build us up to live for you. I pray this in your name. Amen. So the humbling of Jacob begins as he's heading back into his homeland, and he's becoming increasingly more afraid of the conflict with his brother Esau that lies ahead. And we see that even in that, some miraculous things happen. We're told that angels appear to him and give him this reassurance. And even though they came and they reassured him, we see that he was still terrified of experiencing Esau's potential wrath. As his messenger said, hey, we went ahead, we found Esau, he's headed this way with an army of 400 men. And so he hears that, and he goes, I know God's continuing to be with me as he promised me he would at Bethel, but it's really scary. My brother, I know he doesn't like me, he's coming for me with 400 men, and probably any of those men could pick off a good amount of my family that right now consists of servants and a lot of young sons. And so he looks at that, he's just terrified, even though God's giving him these reassurances. And we see that he had run from this problem for years, as we often do as we end up in these problems in life. He had just continued to run away from that, to flee from that. But now his past had caught up to him, and he felt the need, not just, I should probably do this, but he felt the need from the depths of his heart to stop running and deal with this problem that he had been running from. And we see that that is a result of spiritual maturity, of him saying, I'm not just going to try to, push this off a little longer. He said, no, now is the time to deal with this, even though he was terrified. And so as Jacob awaits this coming conflict, he begins to prepare. He begins doing things that, in his fear, he divides his camp up into two, and he says, well, if they come and attack us, then at least this other group can get away quick, and, half of our stuff can be saved in this situation. So he divides his camp into two, and he prepares a gift of 550 animals that he was going to send ahead of him to his brother as a peace offering. And this is a gift that at that time, this would have been something you would have presented to a king. This was a huge gift of saying, I'm trying to show you as much honor as possible. And so he sends these animals ahead to hope that he can kind of appease some of Esau's anger as they approach each other slowly. But then we see another thing, because we've seen throughout the life of Jacob how he has these situations and he kind of manipulates and deceives his way around things. But we see something here that we didn't see in his earlier years, which is instead of just trying to take care of everything in his own strength, he also seeks God in prayer. Look at verses 9 through 12 with me, where we see him pray to God. It says, and Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And so we see Jacob begin to be more humble and more spiritually mature, and he looks at this coming conflict, he feels the fear, and he goes to the Lord in prayer and says, Lord, I need your help. I know I can't handle this situation in my own strength. I'm coming to you. And we see that within this, he confessed that everything up to this point that he had was a result of God extending his mercy and blessing to him. He says, I crossed this river over into this land with just my staff, and now I'm coming back with, a multitude of wealth, a multitude of livestock, a multitude of children. I have all this, and it's not because I was just great and built up this on my own. It was because you have blessed me, God. So he confesses that everything he had was a result of God's grace to him. And we see that he had grown in his ability to see that he was unable to ask God for anything out of his own merit. He's beyond saying, okay, I'll make a deal with you, God. Okay, I'll do this if you do this. And he says, everything I have is a result of your grace. And again, we see this true humility beginning to develop in him. We see this spiritual maturity and becoming less reliant on himself and more reliant on God. And as we try as Christians to live for Christ, we very quickly find out that God allows us to go through tough times in life that help us get to a place where we are able to more fully rely on him. John Calvin describes it this way. He says, in order to stir up our faith, God often allows us to fear things that are not terrible in themselves. God does not promise that he will be present with us so that all danger is taken away from us, but so that fear may not overwhelm us. Moreover, our faith is never so strong at every point that we are able to repel wicked doubts and sinful fears as we would wish. And so we see that we go through these tough times of our life that are difficult and scary. And if we were to go around the room one by one, I'm sure each of you would be able to say, yes, this was a time in my life that was really difficult. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this. You were scared. It was tough. You really didn't know what to do. And this is especially the case with like Jacob. This is a result of our past catching up to us, of us going, I know I did wrong, I know I broke that relationship, I know I was dishonest in this way, and when that comes back to bite us, it's even more scary when our past begins to catch up to us. But we go through these times that are difficult and tough, and we see that God allows us to go through them, and that God isn't absent in these times. That's kind of where our head goes immediately when we're going through a difficult time in life. We go, where is God in this? If God is good, why am I suffering? Why are people around me suffering? And instantly in our head we go, God must not just be here. He must not be paying attention. But we see that God isn't absent in these times. It's actually the opposite, as God uses these times to help us grow closer to him. And especially if you're in the middle of one of those difficult times, you'll go, okay, that sounds nice, but that's not what I'm feeling right now. But we see when we look back often, we go, this was a really difficult time for me, but this is also where I learned to stop trusting in myself and to start trusting and relying on God more. And I was talking to one of my pastor friends recently, and he's quite a bit older, been in ministry a lot longer than me, and we were talking just kind of about the challenges of ministry and some of the things you don't really know about until you're into it. And he was talking about how at one point he'd been in ministry for a while, and he just had a terrible season. He said it was a result of some of my mistakes. It was a result of just other things. He said, but I just went through this terrible season where I was depressed and I was just having a tough time and I was really discouraged. And he said, and you know what? Looking back on that now, a couple years later, he said, I'm selfish enough to say, if I could go back in time and take away some of the pain I felt, I would do that. He said, I didn't like the pain. I don't look back on that and go, that was great. He said, but I wouldn't trade that time for anything. He said, because it was in that time that God began to develop me, that he began to help me be more reliant on him as I was increasingly trying to trust in myself more. And so he said, it was hard, it was humbling, but as I look back, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because those were the moments that I really was able to come closer to God and to get rid of some of those barriers that was preventing me from fully trusting in him. And when we hit these times in life, and often hit them like a brick wall, if it just comes out of nowhere and we go, man, I didn't see this coming. And when we hit these times in life, we see a great example from Jacob here of how we should fall to our knees and pray a similar prayer to him. We should say, Lord, you have told us to go, and you have told us to live for you and to do good. And I know, Lord, as I look at this and what you've called me to and my mistakes, I know I'm not worthy of any of your love or mercy because of anything I've done. But Lord, please deliver me from these hard times because I'm scared and I can only trust in your promises now. And we should pray these types of prayers and pray honest prayers of going, God, I'm mad. God, I'm upset. God, I'm scared. God, I need you now. And I know I don't have any merit to present to you of saying, here's why you should answer my prayers because I'm so good. But Lord, I'm asking on behalf of your mercy and your mercy alone to deliver me through this tough time. And so we see that Jacob here is humbled by his fear. And though Jacob at this point had been humbled to the point of prayer of going, I'm beginning to see I can't do this on my own, we see that God wasn't done humbling him yet. As the moment of facing Esau drew closer, Jacob continued to take steps to prepare for this conflict. He had his servants and his family go ahead of him, and he stayed back alone. And we see here that he laid down and he tried to get some sleep, but we know that was likely restless sleep of him tossing and turning, thinking about what was coming in the near future. But he lays down, tries to get some rest, and then out of nowhere, what would be for many of us our worst nightmare happens when he's attacked by someone and begins to wrestle them through the darkness of the night. So it's pitch black there. He doesn't see who's attacking him, and he begins wrestling with this person all throughout the hours of the night, fighting for his life. And really we see here a symbol of Jacob's life to this point. All his life Jacob had been fighting and scrapping. We see with Esau as he takes his blessing from him by deceiving him, how he deceives his father, how he does things with Laban. We see that he has been fighting and scrapping all the way through life to get what he wants, and now he was quite literally fighting for his life as he was attacked in the darkness of night. And we're told that his attacker saw that he wasn't winning, so he went for the finisher, which probably wouldn't, be the one most of us would go, I'm going to finish this fight, but he just kind of touches his hip. And then Jacob's rendered useless as his hip goes out of socket and he's not able to continue fighting. And this was the moment Jacob knew that this wasn't just some bandit or some normal person who had attacked him. He was fighting someone special, someone divine. And though he had been rendered useless and was unable to continue fighting in his own strength, we see that Jacob didn't give up. Realizing now that he was in the presence of a divine being, Jacob said he wouldn't let him go until he gave him a blessing. He said, I know that you are someone who can bless me, and so I am not letting you go until you bless me. And we see this, and it's easy to think, he's just trying to show strength. He's saying this from a place of power, of going, you're not going to get away from me that easy. But what we see is this wasn't Jacob saying, I'm demanding that you bless me. This was him desperately and tearfully begging for it as he sat defeated and humiliated in the dirt. This is the point where we see Jacob having been completely humbled. He had none of his own efforts to produce. He couldn't fight back. He couldn't trick his way out of this one. He was sitting completely humbled in the dirt, and he begs and he says, please give me a blessing before you go. I'm not going to let you go because I need this blessing because I have none of my own strength to work from now. And there are times in our lives when we're humbled to the point of seeking God in prayer. We go, man, I'm kind of worried about this. I got this diagnosis coming up. I got this family member I'm worried about. I have this issue my friend's dealing with, and we're humbled to the point of prayer of going, I can't do anything to fix this, so I'll pray to God. But then there are times where we are totally humbled, like Jacob was here. We have these seasons where we're wrestling with God and we're wrestling with His will for our lives, and we begin to grow tired after, praying to God for one thing and seeing no results. We begin to grow tired as we wrestle with, why is God allowing me to continue being sick? Why is God allowing me to deal with, this relational strife? And we just begin to get tired, and we wrestle with God and His will for our lives. And, after a while, we just feel that God's not there. We feel that God's not doing things the way that He should. And so we wrestle with Him, we fight, we kick, and we scratch away from God's will for us because we lose trust in it. Or we know God's grace, but we run from it in rebellion. We say, this is God's will, but it's not what I want. I'm going to do what I want to do in this season of our life. And we see that often these times end with us being totally humbled, looking to God, admitting our weaknesses, and begging Him to bless us. And that was my experience, especially in college. I remember about my junior year, I got terribly anxious. I realized that I had real debt. Before it was just kind of sign this paper and we'll keep letting you go to school. And then I saw a bill one time and I said, oh my goodness, I actually owe money and I have no money at all. And I just was increasingly like, I don't know exactly what I want to do. I'm studying, biblical studies, and that's great if I'm able to become a pastor, but that's not really going to help me out anywhere else. And so just all of these things really began to make me anxious and fearful. And I remember going into my junior year that I was like, I'm tired of dealing with this. I'm just going to live for myself. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm not going to worry about this. I'm just going to distract myself from all this anxiety I'm feeling. And it led me into a season of rebellion where I just said, I know what God's will is. I even know what God's called me to do. But all of that's making me anxious and scared right now. So I'm just going to do what I want to do. And that was fine and dandy until one day I got a call for my college pastor. Some of you remember he preached here one time. And he called me into his office on a Wednesday afternoon, which was a really odd time because I was like, we've never met at this time. I don't really know what he wants. But I was an intern at the church at the time. So like, oh, maybe he has something he's going to do. And I remember going in and his demeanor just being kind of weird and things were off. I was like, what in the world is going on? And you have to remember too, at this point, he was like a second father to me. This was one of the people I admired the most, and of someone who I really wanted to impress, wanted to earn their respect. And so he calls me in and he has me sit down at his desk, and I'm not kidding you, I'm not exaggerating, literally reads me a list of all the ways I've rebelled against God in like the last couple of months. And I'm sitting there going, how could you possibly know these things? I was like, I thought I was doing such a good job of hiding my rebellion and trying, to be a good Christian. But he leads me a list of all these things. And he says, are they true? And this was my moment of being completely humbled and going, yeah, they are. And my thought was, the very next thing he's going to say is, get out of here, you're not an intern at this church anymore, I never want to see your face again, I can't believe that you would do these things. But right after reading that list to me and me just really feeling myself come to an end of myself, he goes, a couple of years ago, before I was more mature, I probably would have said, get out of here, I don't want to see you again. You knew better. You shouldn't have done it. But he said, but I want to walk through this with you so that one day when you're at a church, and someone says, hey, I know who that guy used to be, that I can say with you, we walk through this together. We experience true repentance. And within that, what he did was extend grace to me in my lowest moment. And he said, I know who you are, I know you could be, and I don't want you to be defined by this or to run from God. Let's walk together through this. And he extended that grace to me and helped me to be able to work through some of those issues and the underlying, fear and anxiety. He extended grace to me. And this is exactly what we see with Jacob as well here, as he had nothing to offer, as he's asking for a blessing. He doesn't say, I'll give you this or I'll do this. He says, I'm sitting here humiliated in the dirt. I have nothing to give you, God. But we see that God, in his grace, in this moment, as Jacob had come to an end to himself, chooses to bless him. And so now, pretty much completely useless because of his injury, Jacob begs God to bless him. He says, Lord, please bless me. And God responds to him by saying, what is your name? And Kent Hughes explains that in the context of the Bible, to disclose your name could be an act of self-disclosure, a revelation of your character, your deepest identity. And so it wasn't just necessarily, this is what my name is that's on my birth certificate. It was, this is kind of who I am, the definition of me. And so he says, what is your name? And Jacob responds by saying his name was Jacob, which means deceiver, and which was a confession of him in this moment, saying he was named rightly because up to this point in his life, he had been a fraud. He had been a deceiver. He had tried to do things all on his own and only trusted in him. And he, before God, says, I was named rightly. I'm a sinner. I'm a deceiver. I am Jacob. And we see that this response of humility evokes God's grace toward Jacob. Seeing the once proud and deceitful Jacob being humbled, God blesses him by changing his name from Jacob to Israel. Look at verse 28 where we see this happen. It says, then he said, God said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And Israel literally means God fights or God strives. And by renaming him from Jacob to Israel, what God was doing was imparting a new life and a new status on Jacob. He was saying, this is who you were, this is who you will be from now. And that was possible because he had finally come to an end of himself and was able to strive with God. He was able to be what God had called him to be. And having once again experienced God's grace in an incredible way, Jacob sets up a memorial here by naming this place Peniel, saying, I have seen the face of God and have lived. And so we see that Jacob, who was once proud, who was once deceitful, had emerged from this divine encounter a new man who was permanently marked by God. And we even see at the end of the chapter that as a remembrance of this, Jacob's family wouldn't eat of the meat around the hip because they would say, this is how God marked our father Jacob, and we'll remember how God had humbled him. And so we see he's permanently marked by God and comes out of this a new man. Alan Ross says, what he had surmised for the past 20 years now dawned on him. He was in the hands of one against whom it was useless to struggle. With the crippling touch, Jacob struggled to a new direction. With the same scrappy persistence, he clung to his opponent for a blessing. But his goal was now different. Now crippled in his natural strength, he became bold in faith. Having been made weak, having been made useless physically, Jacob had become stronger in his trust and faith in God and could now see that his own efforts were useless. He was finally at this point in his spiritual walk where he was able to fully trust in God after his own abilities had become limited. And we see this same thing in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 12, tells us something very similar. I'll read it for you real quick, verses 1 through 10. He's talking about it and see the parallels between Jacob's experience and the Apostle Paul. He says, I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And so we see here that Paul, just like Jacob, shares his humbling experience of receiving the incredible blessing of salvation, of God's favor being upon him. But to keep him from becoming conceited, God had allowed him to suffer. God had allowed him to receive this thorn in the flesh that would constantly humble him. And he says here, I've went to God 3 times and I've said, please take this burden away from me. But God kept it for him. He allowed him to continue suffering in this way so that God could show him that his grace is sufficient, so that he would be able to be content in any circumstances. And so Paul got to this point where he was humbled and said, life's not about me being comfortable, about me being successful. Life is about me learning to be content even when I'm humbled, and trust that God's grace is sufficient. And what was true for Jacob, what was true for Paul, is true for us. We today still are made strong in our weakness, and we can be content with this in light of the gospel, which shows us how we can't save ourselves, but how God's great grace can. And we see in the gospel that this redemption was accomplished by Christ dying on the cross in our place and then rising from the grave, which made him victorious over death and paved the way for us to trust in him and be united to him by faith. And so we see this and we can have hope and confidence and be able to be content and to even boast in our own weakness, because we say that's the point of the gospel. That's me saying, I realize I can't save myself. I realize that I am torn up by sin. But God in his grace came and did the work I couldn't do so that I could be saved. He died on the cross. He defeated death in his resurrection so that if I would just trust in him, I can be saved. This is what gives us confidence and the ability to be content in our humility, even when we feel like we've come completely to the end of ourselves. And so what we see here is chapter 32 shows us that when Jacob finally came to the end of himself, he was finally able to be made strong in his faith. When he was weak in himself, he was able to be strong in God. And as we think about this and as we finish up and begin to prepare to leave and go into our week, we have to realize that some of us here, some of you here this morning, haven't come to an end of yourself. And you are still trusting in your own strength. You're still trusting in your own abilities. You're saying, I can do this. I don't need God. I don't need God to save me. I don't need God to take care of me. I can be independent. And each of us must learn from Jacob here for Paul here, that we must rely on God, and that without faith in Christ, God will always bring us to this same point of showing us that our self-sufficiency isn't sufficient. And that seems harsh, but it's really an act of God's grace of not letting us continue in self-destructive ways, but showing us our self-sufficiency isn't sufficient, but He is. This is the hope of Christ that is ours by faith, that we can do this because the same God who wrestled with and who blessed Jacob wrestled Satan on the cross, gave us new life, and will never let us go. And so what do we take away from this? I want to suggest three things real quick. Number one, we are blessed when we yield to God and confess that we are fully reliant on Him. That's hard for us to believe sometimes because we do feel this urge of we have to be self-made men and women, but we are blessed when we finally are able to come to the point where we can truly yield to God and confess that we're fully reliant on Him. But we also see that if we don't do that, like Jacob, we will struggle on our own and never truly succeed. But God is faithful to humble us if we won't do it ourselves and show us our true need of Him, which literally changes our lives as we get to this point of going, I can trust in Him, and I don't have to trust in myself. And then finally, something for you guys to reflect on. Again, God may be wrestling with some of you today and trying to show you this and trying to help deliver you from yourself. I just want to encourage you as you reflect on this, as you go into your weeks, to submit to how God's moving, to see how God is blessing you even in the difficult times, because it's those difficult times in our life that show us our true need of Him and bless us by helping us to be able to finally yield humbly before God. Church, I love you.